Tonight, if you have your Bible, we're going to jump into the scriptures. You can open to Matthew chapter 21. As I've been readying my heart to be with you guys, I've become really inflamed in a certain way by the theme of zeal for his house. And we're going to consider that, right? I just don't think it to be a theme for days of gathering or even a unique titling of sorts. But zeal for his house erupts from the scriptures in the consideration of the person of God. And really the person of God and God's interests across the timeline of history as we know it. And so zeal for his house is impossible unless we first develop a zeal for God himself. All right, we just don't have a zeal for his house. We've fallen in love with the one that's loved us. Our lives have been conquered by the beauty of God. And under the weight and the majesty and the worth and the value of the person of Jesus revealed to us by the Spirit, our lives have been overtaken. And in that goodness and mercy pursuing me all the days of my life, our lives have been conquered. Our lives are no longer our own. We live them out of great joy. It is a delight to do your will, right? That's the anthem. It's the heart cry of sons and daughters, even as it was in Psalm 37:4. I delight to do your will, willfully, joyfully. He endured the cross for the sake of what was on the other side and honoring his Father in each and every space, place, assignment, or task that he was called to. And so we recognize that zeal for your house has consumed me, out of the words of Jesus. And in a moment, we're going to look at that in Matthew 21 and several other places. And we're going to consider God's agenda for his house. God's agenda for his house. And I'm believing that by the end of the night, the Spirit is going to provoke a greater aligning to God and anchoring in his house. When I say anchoring in his house, we're obviously going to build something as we consider the scriptures in a variety of places. But God's international mission is expressed as these transformed people. The gospel produces a transformed person. That's what the gospel promises. The reconciliation of all things, the recreation of all things in and through the love and leadership of Christ. And part of that is a transformed company. It's a family of new creatures, a people who are now aligned to God and aligned in a radical way to his purposes. Our lives are no longer our own. Our hearts have been yielded to a meek, kind, tender king that has loved us to the very end of ourselves. He's loved us, he's pursued us. He's wooed us to the point where we bring him everything willingly, joyfully. Even though he knows what's best for us, he doesn't demand it from us. He loves us and invites us to come and give him what he knows he's worth. And he doesn't cheapen the cost because he knows his value. I know what I'm worth and I want it all. And I'm not cutting corners. I'm not going to minimize it. I'm not going to cater to other appetites or agendas. I know my own value, and the call is the call. And what would it profit a man to gain the whole world, and at the end of it all, to forfeit his soul? But those who end up losing their life for my sake and the gospel, they're the ones that are going to be fully alive. They're the ones that are going to find real life, real joy, real purpose. They're the ones that won't have to wonder if at the end of their days, if they wasted their life on something that isn't going to matter at the end of their life. What an amazing privilege to waste your life on Jesus. To give it all for the King of Glory. To have a burning heart and to be anchored in the knowledge of God and radically aligned to God's purposes until the day that his Son returns with fire in his eyes and glory of angelic hosts. That should have been a little bit more exciting than it went over, but I mean, it's all right. Like, We're getting there. It was a missed moment there. But we're going to look at Matthew chapter 21 together in the consideration of zeal for his house. I'm going to read the first 17 verses of Matthew 21. We're going to create a context and kind of jump right into it. Matthew 21, I'm reading out of the NASB for those that are following along. It says, when they had approached Jerusalem and had come to Bethpage at the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied there and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord has need of them, and immediately he will send them. This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. The disciples went and did just as Jesus had instructed them, and brought the donkey and the colt, and later laid their coats on them, and he sat on the coats. Most of the crowd spread their coats in the road, and others were cutting branches from the trees and spreading them in the road. The crowds going ahead of him and those who followed him were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And when he had entered Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, who is this? And the crowds were saying, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a robber's den. And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he had done, and the children who were shouting in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they became indignant and said to him, do you hear what these children are saying? And Jesus said to them, yes, have you never read? Out of the mouth of infants and nursing babes, you have prepared praise for yourself. And he left and went out of the city to Bethany and spent the night there. Matthew 21 gives us one of the instances or the episodes, one of the accounts where Jesus, in subtitling here, is considered the triumphant entry. He's coming from a nearby region or city or town, and he is making his move to Jerusalem. And many believe for the first time entering in as an adult. And he's coming into Jerusalem, and he's not shy about the way that his entrance is implicitly or exclusively implying certain things. He's coming into the city after telling his disciples, go to a nearby town. Many believe Bethany, opposite of Bethpage, close to the Mount of Olives. He says, go into the city opposite you and tell the master there that I have need of the colt that's tied up. The one who commands all of creation is revealing his own sovereignty, his own authority, moving upon the hearts of men and even the created order itself, that being animals, for his own purposes or desires. And it says that when they do that, they come and bring him the donkey and the colt. And it says that he rides into the city. Now, there's a variety of places in the scriptures where this episode is being talked about. We find it in Matthew 21. We find it in Mark 11. We also find it in John 2. Now, a little bit of debate, or not necessarily controversy, about the connection or the harmony of the John 2 account with the others, being Mark 11 and Matthew 21, just meaning is the idea of Jesus going into the temple, because of the varying details that are given by the different writers, is it the same episode? Some say yes, others come to different conclusions. For our case in point, we are going to suggest the similarity of these different accounts, but mainly landing on the harmony of Mark 11 and Matthew 21. And here he's riding into the city. And he's not shy about the way that he's coming. He understands the historical and the prophetic implications about his entrance into the great city. And the king is on the move. And the rightful king of Jerusalem is entering the great city. And he's coming riding on a donkey. Interestingly enough, it's a royal act. Dignitaries in their day, when they were making peaceful entrances into nearby towns, cities, regions, in order to inaugurate or to commemorate something, they would mostly come riding on a donkey. It was a symbol of humility. It was a symbol of peace. It was a symbol that I wasn't there in hostility, that I wasn't there with some urgent intention for violence, that I wasn't there out of judgment or out of anger, that there wasn't no ill intent. And here Jesus comes riding on a donkey into the city where he knows that in future days he's going to establish his throne. And he's going to rule the nations from a mount in the city of Jerusalem. And he's coming this time humbly, not in violence, not out of a declaration of war. And the symbolism can't be missed by those that are present. Now, whether or not everyone that was a part of the crowd actually was anchored in what was really happening, right? Sometimes people just like to gather wherever there's a buzz, right? They don't really have accurate insight into the details of the activities, but they just like to be wherever the energy is. And it's close to Passover. We know that because the details in the text tell us in the coming verses that it's on the eve of what is now going to be the Passover days. So we know that there would have already been a robust crowd of people that were gathering for all of the festivities in the days ahead, and that being Passover and everything attached to that. So we know that there's a multitude of people that are in the city. And many are rallying as they see the buzz. It says the whole city is stirred as Jesus is riding into the city, and rightfully so. The whole city is stirred, and people are shouting, and there are some that are laying down their coats. Symbolism here of many, the poor, those that didn't have material means. Many times they would take their coats off and lay them down in the road as a way to prepare the way of sorts, to roll out the red carpet for dignitaries and royal figures and those that were esteemed and that were highly honored and valued. And they're laying down their coats with this buzz and this energy in the city. And here comes Jesus riding on the donkey. Now, the historical implications is when David was on the end of his days. And it says that Adonijah had tried to assume the throne, even though he was illegitimate. And it says that they rally around David in 1 Kings chapter 1, and they make him aware of the events. And David knows what he's been promised, that one of his sons is going to sit on the throne, and that there's coming a man who in an unending way is going to rule with justice and meekness and humility and the tenderness of God, to reconcile the nations to the holy mountain of God, so that the knowledge of God and ways of righteousness can unfold across the globe in an unending way. And David says, anoint Solomon. And Benaniah and many others that were David's mighty men, they rally around Solomon. And it says that they bring him to Gihon and they put him on the donkey. And as Solomon comes riding into the city, they begin shouting in 1 Kings 1:38, long live Solomon, the great son of David. Well, we know that Jesus is greater than Solomon. And even though here's historical implications, there is prophetic implications as well. Because Solomon, as the son of David, a man of amazing wisdom and might, even military might in his day, to establish the house of God, or the tabernacle, the dwelling and abiding place of God. We know that it wasn't just Solomon that God was after, but that there was one who would come out of the lineage of David that would eclipse and be exalted against and above the praise of how great Solomon might have been in his day. And Jesus is riding into the city, and he's not ashamed of the implications. He's not trying to hide necessarily what everyone is thinking as he is entering in. And he's coming in riding on a donkey. And he's letting the children praise. And he's letting them sing Psalm 118. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And he's allowing the stir in the city to create the energy around his entrance. Much like David did when the ark was coming into Jerusalem. In 1 Chronicles 15, when it says that in the center of the city, he prepared a place for the ark, desiring for the rule of God to extend over the city of Jerusalem and throughout the region, for the outstretched banner of the beauty of God and the revelation of God to bring people into subjection under his love and leadership. So many insights, so many implications as Jesus is riding in, and he's not afraid. He's letting the buzz take place. And it says that he enters into the city. And immediately upon entering into the city, he comes into the temple. The king is on the move. And entering into the temple, he begins to evaluate the things that are taking place there. It's his house. And it tells us that he's there to turn over the tables of the money changers and to put an end to the manipulative efforts of those who were making his father's house a place of business or a den of thieves or a place of robbers, depending on your translation. Now, the king is not ashamed of his entrance, and he's also not intimidated by his evaluation. It says that he comes into the temple. Now, Mark 11 is where things get a little spicy if you read the text. Because it says that Jesus, upon his entry, similar details, comes into the city, all of the historical and prophetic implications, buzz and stir fills the whole area. He comes into what is his house, his father's house. And in Mark 11, verse 11, it says that he just looks around and then he leaves. Consider the moment, if you would. All of the buzz and the anticipation, all of the swirl that fills people's hearts. The king is here, the rightful heir to the throne of David, the one greater than David, greater than Solomon. He's finally arrived. The buzz fills the city, the activity and the energy of all of the crowds. And Jesus is not hiding from the moment, but he makes his way intentionally, directly, immediately to the temple. And it says that he walks in, and in Mark 11, he walks in and he just looks around. I wonder how he looked around. I wonder if he just entered and just took an initial glance. And with everyone's expectations, with all of the hype riding on the event that's taking place, it says that he turns around and he leaves. Well, that's kind of anticlimactic. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Where does that fit in the place of our expectations, our anticipation? How is this the fulfillment? You simply come to the temple, you take a look around, and then you leave. In Mark 11, it says he just looks around, and then he exits with his guys, his disciples that were with him. And it says that they leave, and they leave the city. What is happening here? Well, Matthew 21 gives us a little bit of more insight than Mark 11 does. It's in John 2 where we have the words or the verbiage upon seeing how Jesus acted in the temple. It says that the disciples remembered the text or the scriptures from Psalm 69. Zeal for your house has consumed me. Because in John 2, there's the flipping of tables and there's the whipping. In Matthew 21, there's the flipping of tables. There's the scourging of sorts. There's the acts of purging and purification. There's this activity initiated by Jesus in the temple or in God's house that doesn't seem to match all of the other activity that's taking place in where Jesus has now become present. But the king is in his house, and his eyes like fire are looking around, and the king's evaluation is taking place. And it says that upon Jesus doing what he's doing, that the lame and the blind in Matthew 21 began to come to him, and he healed them. And when the chief priests and the Sadducees and the scribes saw what it was that he was doing, they became indignant. They were offended by the way the king acted in his own house. They were taken back. They considered it to be unreasonable. They considered it to be offensive. They considered it to be unjust. These are just the varying definitions of indignant. When they looked upon the way that Jesus was acting or moving in the house that he knew belonged to his Father, they became indignant and they challenged him. They challenged his own activity in his house. They challenged the way that he desired to move and reveal himself in his Father's house. And they said, "Do you hear what they're saying?" Implying, if you can actually hear it, why wouldn't you put an end to it? Because you know, and we know, that you are undeserving or you are illegitimate of the things that people are ascribing to you. And rather than returning in their debate or in their accusations, Jesus turns them to the beauty of the text. Haven't you read the scriptures? Psalm 8, "For out of the mouth of babes you have ordained for yourself praise." And it says that after their indignant acts towards him, and after healing the lame and healing the blind, he makes the outrageous claim, "My Father's house is to be a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers or a place of business." And he exits. The king's evaluation in his own house brought him to confront the activity and the agendas that were in an ongoing way bringing corruption to the desires that he and his Father and the work, move, and power of the Spirit desired for the purpose of God's house. I wonder if Jesus were to make the same entrance into our houses in this day, what his evaluation would be. I wonder if we would want him to walk into what we call God's house. I wonder if he would be welcome. I wonder if he would be noticed. I wonder if he would be challenged. I wonder if we would be indignant as those who considered themselves to be faithful temple workers and those who in an ongoing way were bringing instruction to the things and the activities happening under the roof of God's house. But the king comes in, and especially in Mark 11, so challenging and confrontational. He walks in, and Mark doesn't tell us he says anything, but he simply just looks around, almost implying piercing the soul and then leaving. What would he see if he came? What would he put his eyes upon if he walked in? What would he be willing to make mention of if he walked into the houses that we say we're building for him? Now, why is this such an issue? Well, you have to understand the context of God's house in that day and the variety of agendas and the compromise and the corruption that polluted what was God's purpose for what he called his house. Political agenda, financial incentives, personalities, platforms, prostituting power and platform in their day became very familiar and almost in some sense normalized by those that were associated with God's house. There was Caesar's agenda that had influenced those that were leading the house. The corruption of materialism, the love of the world and the system of the age that brought compromise to people's hearts as they were manipulating those coming to buy offerings and things in the temple. When it talks about turning over the tables for sacrifice and doves, they were selling people compromised offerings because they knew that the priest would charge them more for their offering if it was deformed or compromised. Oh, how quickly material agendas, and financial incentives corrupt the house of God. Oh, how quickly and swiftly political narratives begin to influence the house of God. And those ruling over with governmental and political powers, leveraging that towards God's house. If we don't for a moment think that these things influence what's going on in God's house, let's just wait till the next political cycle to see. Let's wait till everybody has to consider going back to the voting box to see. Because oh, how quickly we forget how hostile we become when all of a sudden our allegiances with political parties begins to press down upon our hearts. Don't put it too far from you to think that the corruption of Caesar is outside of what we're experiencing in our day. All it takes is political folks showing up at people's churches. Oh, they actually got prayed for. Oh, they must be a real believer. No, you've actually become another just group of people that they're trying to leverage and lobby for political advantages. They'll use your language. They'll show up to your places. They'll even come to your place of worship to do whatever they must do in order to garner or to harness the power that they desire. And how easily we become swayed. How easily we become moved. How easily our hearts, when filled with the influence of things on a lower level, less than the ultimate authority of King Jesus, begin to get traction in our attention and in our appetites. And Jesus comes in the house, and he's not afraid to challenge the agendas that are happening in God's house. And it's time that we begin to recognize the agendas that are influencing God's house. He turns over the tables of the money changers. He turns over the tables of those with manipulative efforts and influence and authority in the house that are disrupting what it is that God actually desires as an anchored purpose for his house. And what is that? Well, Jesus' words are not just his own meaning the first time that they would have been familiar with what it is that he's saying. For my house shall be a house of prayer. This is Isaiah 56:7, where the Lord says, in those days I will bring them to my holy mountain. Meaning the abode or the place where God dwells. I will look forth to the hills, for I know that's where my help comes from. The idea was always on the top of the mount. It's the place where the dominion of God, it's the place where the rule of God would come down and unfold to the nations or throughout the created order. It was the place where the knowledge of God would be unveiled to those that would gather around. And in Isaiah 56, he says, I will bring them to my holy mountain, and I will make them joyful in my house of prayer. And then in that day, their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will become pleasing to me. And my house shall be a house of prayer for all the peoples, or a house of prayer for all nations. We have to understand that the fundamental purpose to God's house is the knowledge of God. The fundamental purpose of the house of God is the knowledge of God. It's the place where the knowledge of God can be encountered or confronted. It's the place where the knowledge of God gets unveiled or unfolded. It's the primary epicenter for the place and the purpose of which God reveals himself. And Jesus says there are many that are encountering my Father's house and are not finding what it is that my Father desires as a fundamental premise or purpose. They're encountering personality, corruption, agenda, other motives, incentives, the sway of people that are in love with the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, which we know according to 1 John 2 doesn't belong to God. 1 John 2, John would say, beloved, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, these things don't come from the Father. He says, but they belong to the world. They are the appetites of the system of the age. They are what is causing the rage on the inside of the human experience to reject the love and leadership of God himself, and to come under the banner with great delight, having our lives become joyfully conquered by the knowledge of God and the beauty of the person of Jesus. It's the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And Jesus comes into the temple and he begins overturning all of the agendas. Oh, how we need our hearts purified for the other agendas that have filled God's house, that are bringing distortion and disruption to the purity of the knowledge of God, that are bringing compromise, that are actually creating a variety of incentives. It's almost heartbreaking to believe that there in those days, there were people that for financial incentive were rallied into the house of God. But once again, let's not put it past our immediate context to assume that these things are not continuing and lingering like a cancer inside of God's house. The financial motivations, those who actually use God's house as a way to get famous, those who actually prostitute God's house as a way to make their own name great, those who actually leverage the bride and the body and communities and houses of worship, houses of prayer, in order to promote or to self-influence a self-exaltation. Those who rally into God's house that are actually bringing disruption to the purity of the knowledge of God because it's difficult to see past them and their own exaltation of their personality and their gifting and their circle of relationships and their opportunities and all of their unique incentives. And how we desperately need a purifying in the house of God, especially in the area of those that we continue to choose to platform. We platform people in churches that aren't even a part of church. They're not even a part of the church. They're not a part of a church, but we put them on platforms in churches. And we pay them to talk to the church about what the church should be doing when they don't actually have their own lives anchored in a church themselves. It's time to stop putting people on platforms that aren't anchored in a people, that you don't have covenant references for. And I'm not talking about little buddies and cliques and little social circles of people that they all subscribe to the same way of life, and there's exclusivity with all of their own titles and all of their own unique distance that they create from the common folk. I'm talking about people whose lives are immersed in a covenant way, in a people, in a local context that are anchored in God's house, that you can actually get references for by people that have a vantage point to what their real life looks like. But our enamoring with gifting, our enamoring with anointing, all of how we fall in love with all of the dynamic personalities and the way people flow and go without even realizing, what authority does someone have to talk to the house that's not living in the house themselves? I'll tell you, no one's coming in my house and talking to my family about nothing who doesn't actually live in the house, or who's not actually authorized by me to be a voice or an influence into those that I'm most intimately responsible for. But the agendas that so quickly fill the house, Jesus is not intimidated to confront the ulterior motives. He's not intimidated to purge the house. Now, amazingly enough, after flipping tables and confronting them in their pride, in their arrogance, in their own efforts of prostitution, and the adultering of their own hearts and lives, falling in love with the things that God's house may provide for them, rather than being anchored in the knowledge of God and having these appetites conquered as we are confronted by the beauty of God continually as we gaze upon him in his house. Right? This is what Asaph said. He said, I looked at those prospering in the world. He says, the wicked. Psalm 74. He says, I looked around at everyone that was thriving. And I became frustrated because I thought to myself, why do the wicked prosper? I thought to myself, why do they get to enjoy life the way they do? Why do they have all of the material things? Why do they get to have all the niceties? And why do they seem to advance amongst all of those that are righteous? He says, I realized that there was an unhealthy appetite that was alive on the inside of me. Because it wasn't just that I was frustrated with how they were living, but there was something in me that desired it too. He says, until I went into the house of God, and until I gazed upon him, and then I understood. Because God transformed my perspective, because he transformed my appetite. God actually changed me so that I could start changing the things I see. And he says, then when I was in God's house, gazing at the beauty of his face, he says, then God began to speak to me about their end and their destruction. And those who fall in love with the things of this life and who have been immersed, given over to the appetite of this material world. Again, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Those who are living in an ongoing way, in a baptism into these things. He says, God conquered it in me, but I had to get into his house. And I had to gaze long. And I had to linger long. I love it. Yes, we love days of saturation, and we love events, and we love gathering even in an ongoing way. But man, I'm telling you, there's nothing like the beauty of God. There's nothing like the beauty of God. There's nothing like when David says, I understand that there's all types of things happening and I could be seeking all types of other things, but there's one thing I'm after. There's one thing I want. There's one thing I seek. There's one thing that's going to define my life. I'm not asking for wisdom. I don't want battle strategy. I don't want wisdom on how to expose my enemies or turn over adversaries. I get it. I'm not even looking for greater income or for material things. I want Jesus. And he says, I want to be in his house. And I want to look into his face. And I want to get lost in the place of gazing. Not just because it's frivolous or because I have massive amounts of time that I don't have to actually, let's just say, put to other things that I have going on. But because I realize that there's a consequence to the knowledge of God. I realize that there's a consequence to the knowledge of God. And Jesus is in some ways hostile to the agendas that are happening in his house because the knowledge of God is no longer an ultimate consideration. And he begins to heal the lame and the blind. Again, prophetic implications of Isaiah 61. For the Spirit of the sovereign Lord is upon me, and he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the captive. And we understand that there's coming a day when the king will take his rightful place in his house. And he will put an end to corruption forever. And he will put an end to perversion. And he will put an end to all of the incentivizing and all of what has become the diluting and all of the derailing of his purposes to his house, not just in an immediate context in Jerusalem, but unfolded throughout the nations. Because it's one thing that Jesus definitely understands, is the international mission of God gets anchored in a local context and expression in God's house. The international mission of God actually gets traction in a local way in God's house. It actually gets its bearings. It has to find its roots in God's house. And when I say God's house, what I mean is God's house as Jesus would have said, my Father's house. We understand house can be a both and, because you have those that say house is people and those that say house is buildings. Well, we understand the Ephesians 2 language. He's uniquely knitting our lives together as living stones to create a living habitation for himself. But we also understand that we can gather in places as they rallied daily at times in Acts 2 to Solomon's porch. Committed, they, not I, they. They. This is an us thing, not an I thing. The I thing gets conquered when we get immersed in the us thing. When you pray, pray this way, our. Acts 2, they devoted themselves to. It's not an amputated thing. Graduation is not amputation. You can't have it all, get it all by yourself. There's a revelation of God that's reserved to the people of God in a corporate expression, as a covenant family, as a house, as a tribe. So we understand that house is a people, but house can also be a physicality of sorts. It can be a place. God filled the house and then filled the people on Acts 2. In the upper room, suddenly, the wind blew in the house before the fire rested on those gathering in it. So it's a both and. And we don't want to get into the little nuances where it's exclusive and we're right and they're wrong. But the understanding is the international mission of God has to get rooted in a local way. And the way that it gets rooted in a local way is in what Jesus calls his Father's house. That's where the mission of God finds its bearings in our city. It's where the mission of God, this grand plan, the eternal purpose of God, gets its traction in our city, in the house of God. And it's why our lives have to be planted in God's house. We're misfits. We're exiles. We're a part of this great Hebrews 11 company who now find our belonging and our bearings in God's house. We don't find them in the world. We don't find them in corporate America. We don't find them in unique little tributaries of social issues or language or political agendas. We find our bearings and our belonging in God's house. And it takes the transformation that happens in the consistent exposure to the knowledge of God to actually align our lives intimately, correctly to God's purposes. Again, we love his house because we love him. We love what he's doing because we love him. We haven't fallen in love with our own power, our own gifting, our own influence, our own name, our circle of relationships, our financial resources or means that we might be stewarding. We have not fallen in love with these things in an ultimate way. These things are secondary, peripheral, if anything at all or best. But we love him. And because we love him, we love his house. Because we love him, we love what he's doing. It's impossible to love the church unless you've been confronted by the knowledge of God and had your heart overtaken by the love of God. But it is very possible to fall in love with yourself and the ways that you can leverage your own desires and demands against God's house for the things that you have an appetite for. It's one of the reasons that Paul instructs a younger Timothy in his life in 1 Timothy 3. When he says, oh man, now we know that he remained in Ephesus. He wanted to be with Paul, but Paul charged him to remain in Ephesus. He said, bro, I'm going to leave you here. I want you to establish elders. Right? In another place, he says, don't let people look down upon you because of your youth. Right? It's the youth group verse that stretches across the universe. But be an example in life and speech. But he leaves a younger Timothy there who's not some adolescent, but he's in his mid to late 30s. Because in the ancient world of sorts, you didn't have a voice into the lives of families and people of consideration that were older until you had crossed into your 40s. And so he tells Timothy, you're God's man on the ground. God's anointed you for this. Right? When you're the exception, you're the exception. And as I've heard it put best, and when you're the exception, everybody else knows you're the exception. Because at times it just takes time in order for certain things to happen or develop. And Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy 3, in the consideration for leaders in God's house. He says, man, amazing. Like you're looking for people. Obviously, he's responding to a letter or questions that were written to him. Amazing. You're looking for people to bear influence in God's house. Praise God. He says those that desire to be an overseer. It's actually a noble desire, task, responsibility. Amazing. But he says, let me communicate to you some of the evidences that you should be looking for. Let me help you in order to dial in some of the insights that you should consider when you are surveying people's lives to bear influence in God's house. You're looking for people to be leaders. And he begins to unfold a list of what we could consider qualifications. And in verse 6 of 1 Timothy 3, he says a man can't be a new convert. Because if so, he's going to be tempted to fall into the same temptation as the devil. You can't be a new believer and bear influence. But bro, have you ever heard her sing? Like, yo, I'm telling you, bro. Like, have you ever heard her sing? Like, when we put her on the platform and call her a leader, like, bro, have you ever? No. Like, I don't care how she sings. Yeah. Well, have you ever heard him pray? Like, bro, when you give him the mic and he opens up, bro, he prays the paint off the walls. Bro, he's just got energy and he's got zeal and I don't care about energy and zeal. Paul says he can't be a new believer lest their heart be tempted to fall into the same temptation as the devil. Well, what was the temptation of the devil? The temptation of the devil was a self-recognized ability or gifting being demonstrated without being yielded to the knowledge of God. It was an appetite or an agenda that wasn't surrendered to the knowledge of God or the beauty of God's leadership. It was an understanding of ability or gifting that was being lived out or expressed with a refusal to come under the leadership of the knowledge of God. Paul tells Timothy, you have to allow time to happen so that over time, the necessary testing that comes upon a person's life to see if they're going to remain faithful to God and to his purposes, to see if through the ups and downs and seasons and scenarios, their life is actually anchored in the knowledge of God. Because this was Paul's ultimate consideration in what anchored God's work in a city. God's work wasn't anchored in a personality. God's work wasn't anchored in an event of sorts. The gospel didn't promise an event schedule. The gospel promised a transformed person. The gospel promised a family of new creatures. The gospel said it could take a person that was dead and now bring them to life. The gospel said a person living under the sway of the wicked one, the influence of the world, in the dominion of the wicked one himself, that they could actually be translated out from under the domain of darkness when they pledged their allegiance to Jesus. And the gospel promised a certain type of person. And these people now living in a local context, Paul anchored them in the knowledge of God whenever he planted a work. Because this is the only ongoing thing that can sustain God's people and God's work in a city. It's the only thing. Paul's jealousy was the knowledge of God. Colossians 1, ever since I heard about you, I've been praying for you, that you be filled with the knowledge of his will, so that with all wisdom and spiritual understanding, you can walk worthy of him and worthy of the call, bearing fruit in every season and giving yourself to every great deed or assignment that he'll called you to, growing or maturing in the knowledge of God. Ephesians 1, I'm praying for a spirit of wisdom and revelation to come upon you in the knowledge of God, so that your hearts can be opened and illuminated, so that you can begin to grasp and to understand and to wrestle with the things that seem mysterious until the Spirit breaks your heart wide open as the knowledge of God You're confronted by it and conquered by it. Because we want both. We want to be confronted by God as He is. And then as God gives grace by His Spirit to conquer our hearts in this tender love, we want to be confronted and conquered. But Paul says in that place of the beauty of God and the knowledge of God, you're going to begin to understand the things that God has actually called you to be and called you to do. Because until our life is anchored in the knowledge of God, it's actually somewhat dangerous to desire and to be given over to the things that God may call us to do, lest we fall in love with what we do more than the God that has called us. Lest we begin to find the value of our life in our assignment. Oh boy. Anyone who's ever had their assignment shifted realizes how difficult it is. And either how much we were anchored in the knowledge of God and found our satisfaction there because we actually became free by the beauty of God that conquered our hearts, or we were still wrestling with all of these other trivial, lower level places of identification, these other places of definition, these other places where if we're not careful, our hearts begin to derive a certain amount of value, and we begin to, in our own hearts, get elevated, or we esteem the thing that we do, and we begin to, in pride, consider ourselves based off of either the success or the failure of the assignment. And if we're not careful, we easily fall into the snare, into the trap of things that we do for God. And if our life isn't anchored in the knowledge of God, then we end up in the swirl and we get carried away. And how many do things for Him that aren't actually anchored in a love for Him? Man, I love the ministry. What about God? Will I do it for God? Well, there's going to be many on that day that say, did we not do these things? So let's be careful to calibrate our hearts with urgency in the hour to allow the evaluation of the King in His house to begin to look around. Not just at those guys, but at this guy that I see in the mirror. Let's allow the evaluation of the King and His piercing eyes as He gazes upon the agendas, not just in the house with generalities, but the agendas and the appetites that are rising on the inside of my heart and my life as I'm anchored in His house. Because it's His house. It's His house. And His international mission is getting traction in every city stretched across the nations of the world from His house. And it's first a covenant people. It's a covenant family. His house is a people. Now those people gather. We already gave description to that. But it's a people. It's a covenant family. It's a transformed tribe. It's a people that have come out of the world and the love of the world and that have pledged their allegiance to this meek King. They're now what Paul would consider in 2 Corinthians 5 representatives. What Hebrews 11 would call misfits and exiles who are passing through this life, seeking a city whose maker and builder is God. They're those that have seen something in God and tasted something of His goodness, that it has absolutely and undeniably unraveled all of the other agendas and appetites that used to be alive in their hearts and have them captive or bound to the things of this life. But they're the ones that have truly come alive, and they're free. They're free. Send me anywhere. I'll do anything. That's the man that's freest. That's the woman that's freest. The one whose devotion no longer demands a context. I'll go anywhere. I'll do anything. Because it's Christ in me. I no longer need a particular title or assignment. God can call me anywhere. He can ask me to do anything. Why? Because I'm free. It's this transformed people gathering together as heavenly colonies upon the earth in every local context stretched across the nations, living as representatives of this amazing King. They're heralding the great gospel message in every space and place. So there is a multiplied effect of the missional aspect of the house of God. The first is to establish a covenant people. That's primary. It's not peripheral, it's everything. It's not only for extroverts who actually like interacting with other folks. The gospel establishes a new people. It's a new creation. It's a family anchored in the knowledge of God in a local context and expression. It's a people whose lives are knit together, who have pledged their allegiance to live in covenant loyalty to Jesus and one another. And in a shared way of life, they are, as a people with a shared way of life, becoming a house of prayer. We want to be a house of prayer. Praise God if we rally together in prayer rooms. But the distinction is not only what happens in rooms, it's what happens carried upon a shared way of life. It's the expression of God on a people as His heart has invaded their immediate life and all of their space of influence, where together, as they're being knit together in a shared way of life, they are bearing His burden and ministering to His heart in a day and night, night and day kind of way. And yes, we want time in rooms, but we also want a shared way of life that with integrity with God and others is going to establish us as a house of prayer. And then we want to raise others up according to this way of life. Right? In certain cases, we've planted our own work on a fourfold vision for God's house. It's church as a covenant people, a family living in covenant loyalty to Jesus and one another. It's the work of God in our local city to establish a transformed people. It's the inheritance of Jesus. We want Him to have what He's been promised from the people of our city. A people from every people. And in our city, we're anchoring our lives in the knowledge of God, because this is where it begins. We want to be transformed as we're confronted by the beauty of God. And we want to continue to gaze and to linger and to look and to behold, so that God can transform this covenant people. And out of that, we want to continue in a shared way of life to build and become a house of prayer. And out of that, we want to see others raised up in this shared way of life. Because it's not just an event schedule, it's a shared way of life. Something's got to live longer than how long the meeting lasts. Meetings are amazing, but if you're not careful, you develop the addiction to the meetings. We need a shared way of life. It's a variety of ingredients. It's a recipe of sorts for a shared way of life, knit together by the grace and the power and the presence of the Spirit with all of its necessary or varying components. And we want to see people raised up, meaning this is our invitation. Come and anchor your life in the house of God with us. And share life with us and be confronted by the beauty of God until He absolutely transforms you and changes you, so that then He can trust you with the things that He calls you to do. Oh, because we can't be trusted until we've been transformed. Because all of the other appetites and agendas that are still underlying, they find their rising whenever we begin to give way to all of the other incentives without having been authentically conquered by the beauty of God. Well, how do I know it? You know it. You know it. How do I know it? You know it. We evaluate ourselves very well. You're your worst critic, and so am I. But you're also the best evaluation of where you actually are. Regardless of what you're able to put up in front of people, regardless of how activities or demonstrations of anointing or gifting seem to provide a unique or proper cover-up, the authentic self before God is known by God and by you. And like Jeremiah says, at times, the human heart is wicked beyond comprehension. And it takes actually God's investigation or evaluation of our own lives as we are anchored in the knowledge of God to bring to the surface or to bring the necessary exposure of our own heart things that at times we live in intentional disbelief that's actually alive on the inside. Well, that's not really me. Have you ever said this? Well, God knows my heart. You ever said, oh, well, I feel comfortable being around these people in a consistent way because I can just be myself because they know my heart. That should be a terrifying consideration. That all of the other fronts, images, external props that we've developed and become proficient in masking or disguising our authentic person, that we find comfort in being able to bring all of the masks down so that those who probably share in some way or identify with my appetites, my agendas, my brokenness, my insecurities, my struggles, we identify well together so we get one another and I feel comfortable with them and can be my authentic self with them because we're all in a similar conversation or space or place. But they know my heart, praise God. And we disguise our authenticity with the right language. We disguise it with activities. And in an event-driven system that has grown or swelled in the Western world over decades, if we're not careful in calibrating our hearts constantly back to the purpose of God in the knowledge of God and God's house, then we so easily become infatuated with being able to leverage all of these appetites on the inside to the unique environments or activities in an event structure that allows us to continue on in our deception of sorts, of the king's necessary evaluation, of not what's just happening from within the walls of a house or a physicality or space of nations. We like to say neighbors and nations, near and far, locally, regionally, nationally, globally. We want the knowledge of God to be unfolded to the nations, carried upon a transformed people that are actually yielded to his leadership, that have been conformed of sorts or radically aligned to his agenda. They've been broken over time by the beauty of God. And there's a purity of sorts. You can't buy purity. Jesus purges the house because he's jealous for the purity of the house. You can't buy purity. You can't social media followers purity. You just can't enough money in the bank purity, or the right friends or influential ministry relationships purity. Purity is a price paid over sometimes short and other times really long periods of time. Really long periods of time. There is no overnight success story, but the pure in heart shall see God. And you just can't over communicate the necessity for purity in the house of God. The pure in heart shall see God. Hear that. Not the most gifted, not the most dynamic, not the most resourceful, right? Not the most relationally strong, not the most socially equitable, the pure. Jesus purges the house because he's jealous for the purity of the house. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. Man, I'm asking the Lord to give us grace tonight to anchor our lives in God's house. Man, those of us that have been floating, we just kind of been hanging out on the fringes, We just kind of been doing our own thing and, suggesting even to our own hearts and maybe others, well, I don't really need, to be a part of a people or to go all in. Like, I don't have to do the whole church thing. Yeah, I can just kind of rally to meetings or kind of do, the extra things whenever I feel it necessary. I'm asking the Lord to give us grace tonight to actually get anchored in his house, his way, where we wouldn't any longer think that we can determine the terms or that we can define based off of our own agenda or interests where the people of God or the purposes of God, of the house of God, actually get traction in my life. We do to ourselves what Paul considered to be the worst form of judgment that a believer could experience. In 1 Corinthians, he says about the man sleeping with his father's wife, he says, put him out. He says he's unrepentant, put him out. Put him outside. Exile him from the community. Well, the connection here is the Old Testament reference to where the place of God's dominion was a particular piece of real estate. God ruled from a particular piece of real estate, and that would have been the boundaries of Israel in the Old Testament. And any time they transgressed the covenant boundaries, God would exile them. They would be turned over to what was at times the wilderness or pagan rulers, wicked kings and leadership, other adversaries. When their appetites became compromised, he would exile them. He would physically remove them from the land, always with a promise of restoration, always with the hope of being redeemed and restored to the place, the physical place that in the Old Testament represented the place of God's dominion, the place of his banner of protection, the place of the demonstration of his faithful love and covenant promises to his people that he chose to put his affection on. It was associated with an actual place. And the worst thing that they could experience was exile from that place. Well, the New Testament reality would be the idea of God's house. It would be the idea of anchoring locally with a covenant people. It would be the idea of actually being planted and rooted, like Colossians would suggest. It's time to get planted and rooted in God's house, to actually begin to walk well before the Lord. And the consideration for Paul in 1 Corinthians is exile him. Because to Paul, it was the worst form or experience of judgment that a believer could actually have come upon them. Being separated from God's people in God's house. Put him outside of the fellowship. Put him outside of the shared way of life is the implications here. It's not just like put security at the door and ban him from the meetings. It's put him outside of the shared way of life. In his unrepentant state, demanding to live his own way on the inside of the anchored ones, the fellowship of God's house. In his unrepentant state, demanding his own appetites, his own agendas, his own incentives, leveraging his abilities in the compromise of God's fellowship, put him out, Paul says, in hopes that in turning him over to Satan or to the influence of the powers, that God might actually be able to restore him and bring him to repentance. Well, for some of us, we do this to ourselves. Forget having a leader or someone with real authority from God actually exiling us from the fellowship. We do this to ourselves. We choose to live in an exiled way. We choose to live in a self-interested way. What do I mean by self-interested? We approach the church like the mall. We approach the people of God like Amazon. And we browse where we want to browse. We shop where we want to shop. We take what we want to take, but we remain where we want to remain. Oh, it's hilarious because of how true it is. And it's because we've determined where all of that fits in the life that I want to live. We've determined that I'm going to live my own interests, and where that gets traction, I've already created a space for that. We exile, we amputate, we disassociate ourselves. But I believe the Lord is going to give amazing grace tonight to actually pull us in and to anchor us down to the place where we can get planted, so that God's purposes can begin to become accomplished in our own hearts, and so that we can join God's mission locally, regionally, and to those that God gives grace for nationally, globally, the mission of God that finds its bearings in the house of God. And we got to get planted in the house of God so we can get aligned to the mission of God. And the Lord wants to give grace for that. And even for those of us who maybe have been in the house for some time, to expose appetites and agendas. The king is in his house. And like Mark 11:11 says, he's looking around. He's looking around. Man, how we desire pure hearts. He's looking around. And I'm telling you, any little nudge that God may give, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart as they did in the days when they were traversing that wilderness territory. As the writer of Hebrews would say, and even echoing the words of David and the experience in the wilderness, today if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. And I'm telling you, it's time to offload agendas. It's time to expose appetites. It's time to lay our lives bare before the Lord and to say, if there's anything in me that is not in alignment with your purpose for your house, if there's anything that's alive on the inside of me, if there's anything that's been influencing my appetites or getting traction in my attention that isn't of the purity that you desire, speak to me tonight. Man, Lord, give grace and do something in me tonight. If there's a disdain in my own heart for your house because of maybe wounds or hurts that you've experienced in the house of God because of the people of God. Man, you've been church hurt, join the club. Join the VIP list alongside of me. At times, people wound us, but it's undeniable and unavoidable that God uses people to heal us. People may wound you, but God uses people to heal you. It's impossible to think that if you just distance yourself from people long enough, that the wounds over time are going to take care of themselves. It's a lie. It's the influence at times of the wicked one to keep you from the very anchoring of what God desires to do in the healing that he desires to bring on your life. But you don't understand what they did to me. Jesus would say, you don't understand what they did to me. I've been talked about, I've been betrayed. He would say, I've been talked about, I've been betrayed. I've been crucified. I've been mocked, spit on, and left for dead. Let's join the club. But it's time to offload the excuses and to see the beauty of God's intentions for his house and the knowledge of God anchored in our city by a people that are anchoring their lives in the knowledge of God and going all in with the beauty of God as the ultimate way to live day and night, night and day. And being influential relationally to pull others in and to raise them up in a shared way of life, gazing at the beauty of God consistently. And then by God's grace, to come up under his leadership as he commissions us to a variety of spaces and places, locally and regionally, globally, for unique assignments, missions, things that God will disclose out of a heart that's been conquered by his beauty. I believe the Lord is going to give us grace tonight. And this might seem like some elementary issue to you, getting anchored in the knowledge of God in the house of God. But it is actually of utmost importance, because it is only those anchored in God's house and the knowledge of God that can hasten the day of his coming. When you say, prepare the way of the Lord, that actually means something. It's not just fancy verbiage or lyrics to a song, but it's a way of life, even as John the Baptist understood. He understood his own life and influence and how he was wasting his life on Jesus in the context of God's house and what had been communicated throughout the scriptures. For I am the voice of one calling out in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord. John understood his immersion in the knowledge of God and a way of life that actually contended for the unveiling and hasten the day of the coming. It's time for us to get anchored in God's house. It's time for us to calibrate our hearts to the knowledge of God and to God's agenda for his house. And it's time to contend with a shared way of life for the unveiling of the beauty of God over our own lives and extended to our city. And then the conquering of our own hearts and the agendas that are alive on the inside, so that we might with great purity see the Lord and partner with him in whatever endeavor, assignment, or objective he may call us to. We want to see God's international mission get deeply rooted in our local expression.